All of our presidents, just like all world leaders, have been men of controversy, whether earned or not. Some were incompetent, others well-meaning, and a few just evil in nature, and in this series, we let you decide after providing the evidence. Andrew Jackson was always controversial, both loved and hated during his lifetime, and those opinions still exist today. We will examine his heroics and questionable activities, which even by today's standards may appear to be quite brutal. Who was Andrew Jackson? How did he rise from humble beginnings to the heights of power? What were his major controversies? What is his legacy? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in Waxhaw, South Carolina. Jackson was born into extreme poverty and did not have a formal education. As a boy, the American Revolution came to his area and fighting raged from 1780 to 1781, and his family suffered, his mother and two brothers dying. At age 13, Jackson was taken prisoner, and he ran afoul of a British officer who cut him with a saber after he defiantly refused to shine his boots. For the rest of his life, he hated the British, a hatred he would carry for the rest of his life. He taught himself to read, and after the Revolution, he studied law at Salisbury, North Carolina, and was admitted to the bar in 1787, and the following year, he became the prosecuting attorney of the Western District of North Carolina, which soon after became the state of Tennessee, settling in Nashville. For almost 30 years, Jackson was allied with this group in Tennessee politics. Jackson boarded in the home of Colonel John Donaldson, where he met and married the colonel's daughter, Rachel Robards. Jackson was elected as the first representative from the new state of Tennessee to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1796, and he served one term and refused to run for re-election. But he did run for a seat in the U.S. Senate and won, but he resigned a year later. Soon after his return to Nashville, he was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia in 1802, a position he still held when the War of 1812 opened the door to a command in the field and a hero's role. He then became a judge in the Tennessee State Supreme Court and served in that post until 1804. In March 1812, Jackson issued a call for 50,000 volunteers to be ready for an invasion of Canada, as he saw war with Great Britain coming. After the declaration of war by Congress in June 1812, Jackson offered his services and those of his militia to the United States. When Jackson was given a command, it was to fight against the Creek Indians, who were at that time allied with the British, who were threatening the southern frontier. In a campaign lasting only 5 months, from 1813 to 1814, Jackson completely destroyed the Creeks at the Battle of Topeka, called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. In August 1814, Jackson moved his army south to Mobile, Alabama, and was without specific instructions, but his real objective was the Spanish post at Pensacola. His motive was to prepare the way for the U.S. occupation of Florida, which was then a Spanish possession. Jackson's reasoning was that Spain and Great Britain were allies at that time in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Jackson learned that British troops had landed at Pensacola. In November, he led his army into Florida, and on November 7th, occupied Pensacola when the British evacuated it to go by sea to Louisiana. Jackson then marched his army overland to New Orleans, arriving in December. He made powerful allies and often stayed with Jean-Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville, a powerful politician known for his playboy lifestyle. He also made an alliance with the pirate brothers Jean and Pierre Lafitte, who provided troops, scouts, and much-needed gunpowder. One Jean Humbert, who had served in the French Revolutionary Army, was part of Jackson's staff. Humbert had fled to New Orleans after it was discovered that he was having an affair with Pauline Bonaparte, the wife of his commanding officer, Charles Leclerc. Jackson also had ad hoc militias from Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as buccaneers, smugglers, and Choctaw Indians within his ranks, as well as Creole and Anglo-American militia. The Americans had fought a few small battles which were mostly unplanned contacts. Jackson also ordered martial law in New Orleans and held it until he had confirmation that the war was over. On December 14th, the British defeated the small American fleet at Lake Borgne, and 9 days later, they landed and took Jackson by surprise. Jackson decided to attack, but he took heavy casualties, but the British also took casualties and could not advance. Jackson was able to fall back to the Chalmette line, 5 miles downriver from New Orleans, which was very defensible. The British plan was to capture New Orleans at all costs. Jackson's mission was to see that did not happen. The British had very few options, as the bayous were full of alligators and poisonous snakes, preventing a flanking on foot, and movement by boat was a problem due to the small number of boats available. Likewise, a formal siege was not possible given British logistics and lack of cannon, and illness was also rampant in the British ranks. Jackson's hastily organized defense proved adequate despite being heavily outnumbered, and the British attacked on January 8, 1815, and they suffered heavy losses, forcing them to withdraw. What Jackson and the British did not know for certain was that the war was already over, although rumors did persist, and news of Jackson's great victory followed the news of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814. Jackson, hearing of the treaty, knew that Congress had to ratify it, so he maintained martial law, even executing 6 of his own men for desertion. In fact, Louisiana State Senator Louis Louvalier wrote an unsigned article in the Louisiana Courier that criticized Jackson for not returning civilian authority. In return, Jackson had him jailed. U.S. District Court Judge Dominic A. Hall signed a writ of habeas corpus for the imprisoned senator, and for his trouble he, too, was jailed. A military court exonerated Louvalier, but Jackson ignored the verdict and kept the politician detained. Such was his personality. The Battle of New Orleans had made Jackson a national hero, and he was appointed commander of the Southern District. The locals lauded him as a modern Caesar. Jackson decided to take leave, and he entrusted the command of the troops in the field to his subordinates while he retired to his home at the Hermitage near Nashville. But he was brought back to active duty at the end of December 1817, as there were revolts by Native Americans along the southeast border. Jackson had no specific orders, so on his own initiative he invaded Florida and captured 2 Spanish posts and appointed one of his subordinates as the military governor of Florida. He captured the Spanish forts at St. Mark's, Pensacola, and several other towns, and claimed the surrounding territory for the United States, also capturing 2 British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, and he had them hanged. The Spanish, somewhat upset, filed a diplomatic complaint from Spain, precipitating a cabinet crisis in Washington. Jackson was defended by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who almost single-handedly saved Jackson from censure and hastened the U.S. acquisition of Florida. Jackson at first had no plans for continuing a political career, but the people of Tennessee in 1822 convinced the Tennessee legislature to nominate him as a candidate for president. The next year, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. The 1824 election had 4 candidates receiving electoral votes. Jackson received the highest number of 99. The others receiving electoral votes were John Quincy Adams, who received 84, William H. Crawford, 41, and Henry Clay, 37. Because no one had a majority, the House of Representatives was required to elect a president from the 3 with the highest number of votes. Adams was elected on the first ballot. When Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, it seemed to admirers of Jackson to confirm the rumors of a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Jackson, seeing underhanded activities, became a candidate again in 1828. In 1828, Jackson defeated Adams by an electoral vote of 178 to 83 after a campaign in which personalities and slander played a larger part than in any previous U.S. national election. One of the great slanders was that Jackson and his wife Rachel Robards, despite their long marriage, had been vilified in campaign pamphlets as adulterers. The basis was that Rachel Jackson was not legally divorced from her first husband, hence the name Robards, at the time she and Jackson were wed. When they discovered their mistake, they remarried, but the damage had been done. Rachel died at the Hermitage on December 22, 1828. Jackson had these words inscribed on her tombstone, quote, "A being so gentle and yet so virtuous, slander might wound but could not dishonor." Rachel had dreaded becoming the hostess of the president's house, saying that she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that place. Nonetheless, the election of 1828 is often considered a major turning point in the political history of the United States. Jackson himself once said, "I know what I am fit for. I can command a body of men in a rough way, but I am not fit to be president." Yet today he is regarded as the maker of the modern presidency, founder of the Democrat Party. When Jackson was inaugurated on March 4, 1829, it was the first time in more than a quarter of a century that the election of a new president reflected the repudiation of his predecessor. Jackson's election brought him into office, and despite his short terms in the House and Senate, outside of being a military commander, he had no foreign policy experience. But Jackson was also a very ill man when he became president. Jackson was in fact a tyrant. He made it clear that he would conduct business as he saw fit, despite his cabinet appointments, becoming known as King Andrew I. In making decisions and policy, Jackson relied on an informal group of newspaper editors and politicians who had helped elect him, and they became to be known as his kitchen cabinet. During his 2 terms as president, Jackson removed fewer than 1/5 of all federal office holders. Many of his friends who assisted him had hoped to get positions in his administration, but Jackson, to his credit, kept those people he thought were useful and competent. But Andrew Jackson's illness was quite obvious, and many did not believe he would live out his term. So people looked to a successor, such as his vice president, John C. Calhoun, also from South Carolina, and the other option was the Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. Also in 1829, the state of Georgia extended its jurisdiction to 9 million acres of land still occupied by the Cherokee Indians, who actually still held legal title. But when gold was discovered, Georgia was in violation of the treaty with the United States and the Cherokee. The Cherokee appealed to the federal courts. In 2 separate cases, the Supreme Court ruled against Georgia in favor of the Cherokee, but Georgia ignored those decisions and continued to enforce its jurisdiction within the territory claimed by the Cherokees, often violently. Jackson, never a friend to Native American tribes, made no effort to restrain Georgia, as there were still rumors about Jackson's health. This was when John C. Calhoun was courted as the obvious successor. But Calhoun himself was no friend of Jackson's, as he had wanted Jackson to be censured for his invasion of Florida, which Jackson learned about only in 1830, so Van Buren seemed to be his successor should he fail to serve his 2nd term. Jackson had serious enemies, especially as the election of 1832 approached, since Jackson's opponents hoped to embarrass him due to the charter of the Bank of the United States, which was due to expire in 1836 during his term. Few presidential vetoes have caused as much controversy in their time or later as the one Jackson sent to Congress on July 10, 1832. The veto of the bill to recharter the bank was the prelude to a conflict over financial policy that continued through Jackson's 2nd term, which he nevertheless won easily. Efforts to persuade Congress to enact legislation limiting the circulation of banknotes failed, but there was one critical point at which Jackson was free to apply his theories. Jackson issued the Specie Circular in July 1836, which required payment in gold or silver for all public lands, as he was not a fan of paper money. Many of the banks could not compete and began to fail, and the effect of bank failures in the West soon spread to the East. Jackson needed money and wanted to impose tariffs, especially on South Carolina, to raise revenue due to its massive agricultural produce and exports, which in 1832 required congressional leaders to seek a compromise in the form of a moderate reduction of the tariff. South Carolina adopted a resolution declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void, and prohibiting the enforcement of either within its boundaries after February 1, 1833. Pressed, Jackson agreed to a tariff reduction. But Jackson accepted the challenge, denounced the theory of nullification, and asked Congress for authority to send troops into South Carolina to enforce the law. On March 1, 1833, Congress sent Jackson 2 companion bills to reduce the tariff duties on many items, and the Force Bill, which empowered the president to use the armed forces to enforce federal laws. South Carolina repealed nullification, but also declared the Force Act null and void. One of his greatest opponents was the abolitionist movement, who detested him. Jackson faced the first real possibility of a civil war and a secession of states over this issue of tariffs, and slavery was on the back burner. But the Georgia problem with the Cherokee still existed, and Jackson's failure to support the Supreme Court remains an indelible stain on his record. This is just one example of Jackson's policies against the American Indian when white settlers wanted their lands. Jackson invoked the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and granted the Indian tribes unsettled western prairie land in exchange for their homelands. The Cherokee were forced to sign another treaty in 1835, giving up their land in exchange for land in the Indian Territory west of Arkansas. 3 years later, General Winfield Scott forcibly removed some 15,000 Cherokees who were forced westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears during the cold and wet winter, and nearly a quarter of them died of starvation, illness, and exposure. The greatest resistance came from the Seminoles in Florida, which would not be concluded until the end of the savage Second Seminole War of 1835 to 1842. They were forced as far west as Arkansas and Texas. Jackson's policies overall were well received, and he left office more popular than when he entered it. His decisions exercised a profound effect on the character of U.S. politics for half a century. His success appeared to be a vindication of the new democracy and his party. Jackson was also a fervent supporter of slavery, which was adopted by his new Democratic Party, and the intensity of the political struggles from 1825 to 1837 led to the revival of the two-party system. It also sowed the seeds for the future Civil War. Andrew Jackson was himself a slave owner and seemed to have no issue with the institution, and he insisted that those he hired to manage the farm treat my Negroes with humanity. Slavery was also the primary source of Jackson's personal wealth, and he wanted to protect his assets. When he wrote to Graves W. Steele, the overseer accused of causing an enslaved man's death at the Hermitage, he demanded a full account of your guardianship with the loss of my property. Jackson ordered harsh, even brutal punishment for enslaved people who disobeyed orders. When an enslaved woman named Betty was judged to be guilty of some improper conduct, he wrote to his overseer that she must be ruled with the cowhide and should be given 50 lashes the next time she misbehaved. When an enslaved man ran away from the Hermitage, the punishment was even more extreme. He put an advertisement in the Tennessee Gazette that promised a reward for the man's return, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300, which would almost certainly have killed the runaway slave. This choice of language suggests that he cared more about the financial impact of the death than he did about the man's life. Jackson did sometimes live up to paternalistic ideals. The enslaved people he owned could not leave his property without his consent, had no access to education, and worked long hours with no pay. Jackson also brought several of his slaves to Washington to serve in the White House. One story was that George, an enslaved man and the son of longtime Hermitage cook Old Hannah, served as Andrew Jackson's manservant. He was in his early 20s when Jackson brought him to the White House. He slept in the president's bedroom on a pallet next to his bed so that he was accessible anytime Jackson needed him. A manservant was always on call with no real time off. Faithfully, George remained at the president's side for decades, whether he wanted to or not. When Jackson died in 1845, George was standing next to his sickbed. Andrew Jackson was definitely a man of his times, prudent when required, ruthless when necessary, but always certain of his actions. He rarely hesitated to take decisive action regardless of the controversy, hence earning the nickname Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson died on June 8, 1845 at his home, the Hermitage, now Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.